Huh. So that's what you do with one of those. Hello there, fellow travelers. I'm Tim from Secret Fire Books, and today we'll be reviewing The Iron Man by Robert E. Howard. Play the intro. Play the intro! So back in February, I did a big book haul video where I showed off a bunch of Robert E. Howard paperbacks that I picked up off of eBay. And one of them was this little book, The Iron Man, which, do not let that cover fool you. It is not fantasy. It has nothing to do with fantasy. This is actually a collection of boxing stories by Robert E. Howard. It's actually 3 short stories and part of an essay, but we'll get to that. So Robert E. Howard was an incredibly versatile writer back in the 1930s. He wrote a bunch of different genres. He's most well known for his fantasy and horror stories, but he wrote a bunch of different genres for a bunch of different pulp magazines back in the day. He wrote everything from fantasy to horror to westerns to science fiction to historical stories to softcore erotica. So yeah, a little bit of everything. But among those genres was the sports drama, and the sport that Robert E. Howard loved the most, the one he was most passionate about, was in fact boxing. Now, not only was he a boxing enthusiast, not only did he know his boxing history, there are a lot of reports that he was actually a semi-professional boxer. I don't know if he has like any semi-professional record or anything like that. I tried to look it up, there's not much information about it. A lot of people say he never actually boxed, that he was just really enthusiastic about the sport. But either way, boxing was huge back in the early 20th century, and especially around the 1930s. In fact, boxing back then was even more popular than American football is today, if you can believe it. Now, I personally don't know a lot about boxing, but I do know that if there's any kind of hobby or special interest that gets a lot of attention, there are going to be people that try to capitalize on it. And that was very much the case back in the early 1900s, as much as it is nowadays. And since boxing was so popular back then, there were of course a bunch of different outlets that tried to capitalize on boxing craze. And one such outlet was the pulp magazine industry. And so a lot of different magazines were springing up about boxing, publishing articles and advertisements and short stories about boxing. And so Robert E. Howard, who loved writing stories for pulp magazines and loved boxing, sprang at the opportunity, and he wrote at least 13 different stories that we know of about boxing, 3 of which made their way into this volume, The Iron Man. Now, there's only 3 of them because they are the ones that circle around a particular theme and kind of central narrative that seemed really important to Howard, both in his writing and in his life in general. And that is the concept of the Iron Man. The first part of Howard's writing that you'll read in this book after the introduction is part of an essay called Men of Iron. It's only a fragment. Howard never actually finished the essay in his lifetime, but he wrote just a few paragraphs, and it seems to be about this theme and concept that seemed very near and dear to his heart, and that is the idea of what he called the Iron Man. The Iron Man was kind of an archetypical boxer, as Howard put it. There are obviously all these different kinds of boxers. There are boxers who focus more on technique, getting around their opponent's guard, playing for points. There are the sluggers who rely mainly on their strength, hitting really hard and knocking their opponent out as soon as possible. But then there were the type of boxers that Howard was fascinated by, and he called them the Iron Men. These were boxers that had this sort of almost supernatural toughness and stamina that kind of outlasted everyone else that they fought. The idea was that these weren't really boxers who had any kind of technique. They were really just gimmick fighters who brought in large crowds to see how much punishment they could take in the ring. These boxers notoriously didn't have that many wins on their records. They solely drew crowds because the crowds wanted to see them get the crap punched out of them and yet see if they would stand up at the end of the match or not. And even though it wasn't like, obviously this glorious position to have, this sort of super attractive quality to be a boxer whose only real technique was, having a lot of stamina and getting the crap kicked out of you and waiting for your opponent to tire out. That was still fascinating to Howard, because Howard grew up in, unfortunately, a very violent time. He grew up in the early 1900s in Texas. So in that case, the Old West was still very much a thing back in the day. The American Old West was still very much a thing. There were still parts of the Texas territory that were being settled by the American government, and they were still disputed between the government and the Native Americans who were living there. There were still oil fields that were being mined. In fact, Robert E. Howard points out in his own word, well, I'm paraphrasing it, but he said at one point something along the lines of, there's nothing like an oil boom to teach a child that the world is a terrible place. And so that is the very kind of dark and tumultuous time that Robert E. Howard grew up in. And it taught him, as a young man, that in a violent, dark world, you need to be a violent, dark person in order to survive. That was very much something that he believed, and it's very much something that comes through in his writing. If you've read any of his stories about Conan or Kull or Solomon Kane, you'll see that violence and overpowering, evil with your own brand of violence is very much something that Howard believed in. You might not agree with it, but it is a reoccurring theme throughout all of his writings. And that is very much evident in his article, Men of Iron, where he points out that even though these types of boxers, they didn't play for points, they didn't win that many matches, they were still these incredibly tough men who could get the crap kicked out of them and still stand up. He keeps coming back to one particular boxer over and over again in this essay, as well as the 3 short stories that are in this book. And that was a boxer by the name of Joe Grimm. Joe Grimm was a early 20th century boxer who, much like the boxers that Howard wrote about in this book, didn't play for points, didn't have all that much technique, didn't really have all that much strength behind his punches. He didn't have that many wins on his record. But he was incredibly tough. He was almost supernaturally tough. He could get into a ring, his opponent could wear themselves out, for hours on end just punching this guy, and this guy would still get up. He could not be knocked out. In fact, sometimes at the end of matches, he would be beaten bloody, he'd have blood coming out of his eyes and mouth and ears and nose, but he would still be jumping around the ring and smiling, and he would stand up on the ropes sometimes and deliver his famous catchphrase, "I am Joe Grimm, I fear no man." And I think that really struck a chord with Howard. After one of their fights, one of Joe Grimm's opponents was quoted as saying, "I just don't believe that man is made of flesh and blood." And I don't think it's a stretch to say that it's people like that that really inspired Howard to write the stories and the characters that he did. Now, obviously, like I said, he grew up in a very tumultuous and dark era of American history. And so I think the idea of a character who, no matter what the world threw at him, could still struggle through and still stand up again and still face the world with this kind of mocking smile on his face. I think that type of character was very much what Howard wanted to exemplify in his writings. I think it was very inspirational for him. The 3 stories that you'll read in this book are the title story, The Iron Man, They Always Come Back, and Fists of the Desert. The Iron Man is about a character who, much like Joe Grimm, is this gimmick fighter who just plays matches to kind of draw crowds who want to see how much punishment he can take. He just struggles through them all, and it's this real survival story that kind of has this bittersweet ending to it. They Always Come Back is a story about a retired boxer who actually retires after a fight with the main character from the first story. And it's all about his redemption arc. It's all about him coming back and learning to be a better fighter and, kind of get his mojo back, I guess. And the last story, The Fist of the Desert, is this sort of boxing story crime drama mashup, where we have a boxer who initially works with a manager who has ties to the mob, and that goes very poorly for him eventually. And afterward, he goes straight, gets with a manager who is totally legit, but the sort of dark shadows of their past come to confront them, and you have to see how that resolves itself. So they're very quick, pulpy stories, but much like the stories of Conan and Solomon Kane and all of Howard's fantasy and horror characters, it very much has this sort of mythological feel to it. Howard takes the idea of a boxer and sort of morphs them into this kind of Herculean hero. Much like I said, he kind of idealized fighters like Joe Grimm and the other Iron Men of the ring. And so very much the characters in his boxing stories were these idealized versions of boxers, these super heroic figures who very much exemplify the same kind of themes and concepts that he was going for with Conan and Solomon Kane and those kind of characters. I think even if you're not a particularly big fan of boxing or sports dramas in general, you will still get a lot out of this book, especially if you're already a Robert E. Howard fan. I'm not much of a boxing fan. I haven't read boxing fiction except for this. I've watched the Rocky movies. That's about as much boxing fiction as I've consumed. But I really did enjoy this book. I got to the end of it, and I was really satisfied with what I read. So I think even if you're just a fantasy fan, you will really enjoy this book. Because, like I said, he injects a lot of that grandeur and mythology into these stories, just as he does with his fantasy stuff. But that's just what I think. If you've read The Iron Man by Robert E. Howard, please let me know what you think. What did you think of this kind of look into Robert E. Howard's psyche and how he sees the world of boxing and how the world of boxing has influenced his writing? Let me know in the comments. And until next time, guys, farewell and keep reading.